Hi everyone, welcome to We've Got This, a panel about climate solutions and how we as individuals can create collective action, particularly in the arts industry. It's what you're all here for, and hopefully we can give you a bit of hope today and lift your spirits about the climate crisis and the world that we're living in. But before that, a few things. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Kaurna land today. The soil that we stand on is unceded territory, and Kaurna people have been caring and taking custodianship of this land for over 60,000 years. I also want to respect that we've had Writers' Week here for the whole week, and we've got the Adelaide Festival happening on this land as well. And that storytelling and arts have existed on this land also for 60,000 years, and that the climate crisis and arts are inherently connected. And in that way, we have to look to First Nations justice in order to solve the climate crisis. Some more housekeeping things. Thank you. A COVID reminder. We also want to keep each other safe today and throughout all of Adelaide Festival's events. And if you've been here for Writers' Week, you'll know what the protocols are. We highly recommend that you wear masks and that you are socially and physically distanced from people during the events. There's also sanitizer kind of around the grounds. What you'll also find around the space are QR codes for Reforest, which is an app that the festival have partnered with. When you scan those QR codes, the app will actually offset your carbon emissions from attending today by planting trees. So it's an excellent thing that you can do. You can also sign up for the app and get them to plant trees at any time in the future by using the app. So, before we get started, my name is Ord Mason Hyde, and I am a queer, non-binary climate activist. I'm also a speaker and an actor, and I do some workshop facilitation, but it is my first time moderating a panel, so be kind. And with me I have, thank you. With me I have Rob Brookman, who is a leading Australian theatre producer, festival director, cultural programmer and arts administrator. He's held leadership positions in a number of Australasia's foremost festivals and performing arts organisation, including some familiar faces, the Adelaide Festival, Adelaide Festival Centre, National Festival of Australian Theatre, New Zealand International Festival of Arts, Arts Projects Australia, Sydney Theatre Company and State Theatre Company South Australia. So a lot of credentials there. And you might also know him as one of the co-founders of WOME Adelaide, which is on this weekend. What struck me when I met Rob was that he is a very passionate man, and you're very passionate about pushing climate change solutions and sustainability solutions in those companies you work for. And I guess I'm wondering, Rob, what's been kind of difficult about trying to make internal change within organisations, but also what's been great about it, what's been uplifting about that?
Yeah, I think the difficult thing usually is money and commitment further up the food chain, basically. But there are problems to solve and to work your way through. The great strength in the projects that I've been involved with has been the people. When we, for example, set out with Sydney Theatre Company to take it carbon neutral, which was back in 2010, the first thing that we did was to get together the entire staff and company of Sydney Theatre Company, which is about 100 people, and to talk to them about it. And I was interested to test the water and see what kind of buy-in we were going to get from a group of that size. And look, you could probably guess that within a theatre company you'd probably find more people that are passionate about environmental issues than you might find in other places. But I still figured that there would probably be 20% of the people in our company who wouldn't really care that much, and I was completely wrong. There was about nobody who didn't care. So the buy-in from that group was just absolutely massive. And that really was the engine of the whole project that which we ran, which included building Australia's second largest rooftop PV array at the time. There's bigger ones these days. And a whole rainwater harvesting project, and we went through every aspect of what the company did, whether it was building sets, lighting shows, all the way down to costumes and makeup, and how could we source things sustainably And over the period of 2 years, the company eventually got to that point of complete carbon neutrality. And it was a massive point of pride for everybody who worked in the place. It was a huge point of pride for our board. And it was a huge point of pride for our audience. So it became a combination of, you know, a lovely positive reinforcement loop within and externally. So it had wonderful ripple effects. And I think it's the same with the other projects that I worked on, that essentially it's just getting people to buy in is number one.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and a really good example of collective power within an organisation, which I think is great. We've also got Jess Scully streaming in from Sydney, who should be up on the screen, I believe. Hey, there she is. Hello, Jess.
Hey, Ord. Hi, everyone.
Very excited to have Jess here today. Jess Scully is an author, arts curator, and the Deputy Lord Mayor of Sydney. Her first book, Glimpses of Utopia, Real Ideas for a Fairer World, shares projects and policies from around the world that help us actively build a sustainable and inclusive future. So Jess, your work is largely about finding existing and practical solutions to the climate crisis, particularly on local policy level. So we've got a state election coming up on the 19th of March, and in the lead up to that, and of course the aftermath of that, what kinds of policies can people look for in their electoral candidates, and how do we hold our newly elected officials accountable for enacting these policies?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Darug land today. I usually live and work on Gadigal country, but I'm here at my sister's studio in the Blue Mountains, so I'm on Darug country, and I want to acknowledge elders past and present and the next generation of elders of the Eora Nation, and to acknowledge, as you did too, Ord, that sovereignty was never ceded over this place. And I wish I was with you right now, but I'm really delighted to be part of this. So what to look for? I mean, bold ambition. I think, you know, this is not just the greatest crisis of our time, but it's the greatest opportunity of our time. You know, this is a moment where we can redesign a system that is broken and isn't working for anyone except for a tiny sliver of people at the top of the tree, you know? And so look for people who will commit to concrete, tangible climate action close to home as well as on a broader stage. You know, in local government, it means what they're doing with waste and water. You know, is your local government powered by renewable energy? I mean, it's more common where you guys are, but you know, where we are on the East Coast, it's not that common. And so the City of Sydney, we committed to a power purchase agreement with some community-owned regional New South Wales renewable installations, you know, to help fund the construction of a wind farm in Shoalhaven, a solar farm in Shoalhaven and a wind farm in Glen Innes and Wagga. And that's actually saving us $500,000 a year over the next 10 years on the energy for the City of Sydney, you know. So you can take tangible action at a local level, and leadership can come from the bottom up to influence politics in Australia. And local government can do that, and state government can absolutely do that too. So demand ambition, demand tangible actions, and look at the big footprint items, right? So it's energy, it's waste, and it's transport. And then also think about water and those other kind of key elements that you know, we need to live and that we need healthy ecosystems to maintain. And the last thing I'll say, Ord, is that you know, it can be easy for people to make big promises at election time, but that holding accountable bit is really important. And my number one message to you is that as citizens, we all have the obligation to be active citizens in the time between elections, to make sure that those commitments aren't watered down by the loudest voices in the room, the people who call up or email their councillors or their MPs and say, oh, you said you were going to do it, I'm for climate action, but not for a cycle way. I'm for climate action, but I'm not for, you know, this thing that's going to have an impact in my life. So be a YIMBY, be a person who says yes in my backyard, not no in my backyard, and have your voice heard from the time between elections.
Yeah, wow, that's great. I think some really interesting ideas there about responsibility and our obligation in a democracy to each other. which we will return to later. But first I'm going to introduce Tiahni. Tiahni Adamson is a First Nations youth environmental activist and state coordinator of SEED, Australia's first Indigenous-led youth climate action group. Tiahni communicates climate science through conveying her special connection with land to educate, advocate and nurture sustainable living practices on country. And she's also recently started working for CH4, a climate solutions company. So Tiahni, from your studies and, from your studies and accomplishments in climate science, what would you say is the role of each of us as humans and as individuals in an ecological context? And further, are people able to individually, like one by one, enact meaningful change for the environment?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ord. So before I start, kapakut everybody, which means good afternoon from my people from the Cooreg Nations up in the Torres Strait Islands, right at the top of Queensland. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on beautiful Kaurna land. I'm so lucky to live and work here, as a lot of us are as well, and pay my respects to Kaurna people, past, present and emerging, as well as pay respects to my own ancestry that walk and guide me every day on both sides of my family from lots of different parts all over the world. I'd also like to pay respects to everybody's ancestors that walk with them today, because not until we look back and recognise our history can we actually walk together in harmony in the future. So thanks so much for being here and committing yourself to learning more about climate change and doing your best. In terms of our role, I've been thinking a lot about the way that we segregate and box ourselves as people into specific different cultural contexts, and how important it is for us to unify and not forget our connectedness from nature. First Nations people are really incredible at retaining that connection to country, where we see that we're not separate from country but a really interconnected and divine part of nature, that we're not separate from the earth, we're not separate from the animals and the plants that are here, we are all one unified connected system. And I think that's something really important for us to remember when we take action or inaction, that we are effectively making changes on a variety of different systems, whether we like it or not. So being one unified place and being a part of this system is a really big thing. And I think we need to continue to remember our connectedness to one another, whether that's through gender or sexuality or cultural diversity, and make sure that we continue to have voices at the table that represent a variety of different people. Especially from my background, obviously, I'm really passionate about ensuring that First Nations people have a seat at the table, that we have First Nations leadership, that we have opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to lead and to be nurtured into that space. And so I think unified connectedness is something really important to remember within that, and whatever space you're in, to ensure that we've got that diversity coming through so that we're representing people correctly and we're having all of the voices heard, because we do have all of the skills and all of the knowledge and all of the right information within each and every one of us. We are all divinely intelligent beyond our own belief, and when we unify together properly and respect and nurture each other with pure kindness, we can make massive, considerable change to the earth and make a much better future than what we've currently got.
I think there's something really interesting in what you said about being unified. And this panel is about how we can individually create collective action. And I think what's really interesting is we see a lot of media about what each of us can do in our own homes and our own lives, you know, recycling and composting and taking more public transport or riding your bike. We hear a lot of these individual solutions. And what I want to know is, what do we think the solutions in the arts collectively are? What does it look like for the arts industry to come together and unify in that way and support each other to combat the climate crisis? What can that look like in the future? Anyone, please jump in.
I think artists, arts workers are really attuned to issues of climate, and you know, they just need to find ways to become active. So one of the jobs of the structures, if you like, that they work within, whether that's festivals or performing companies or galleries or, you know, any of those formal structures, is to allow that to and foster that energy to come forward, and to provide the environment in which it can flourish. And that can range from being tiny to being absolutely massive in terms of impact, according to the resources that people can bring to it. Ultimately, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a whole lot of people writing plays about climate change, or painting things or sculpting things about climate change. I don't know that it's, in a way, the change, may be fostered by that. But I actually think that the way that we make, the way that we do, the processes that we go through, that's where the impact of what we do is felt, and that's what we need to change. I mean, it's great to also proselytise through the artistic output that's made, but I think first thing is get the structure right.
I like that organisational support for that to happen. Yeah. Do either of you have?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know it.
We've got a version of this.
I think the challenges that we face in the arts and the creative sector, and the challenges that we face in overcoming the climate crisis, these struggles are interconnected, and as Tiahni said, like, we're all in this together, and I think so one of the great examples that I really enjoyed from my book is about an approach in a town called Rosario in Argentina. And this is a political movement that is also connected to artist cooperatives, connected to food production, connected to reclaiming land for more productive pro-social as opposed to anti-social uses like gated communities. All of these things are interconnected, and there's this beautiful story there of this place called Distrito 7, which means District 7, and it's basically the oldest theatre in the town of Rosario that was about to be knocked over and turned into a car park. Literally, paving paradise to put up a parking lot. And instead, this sort of activist collective that has become a political party in this town have bought this place and turned it into a cooperative where everyone from the cleaners to the actors to the security guards are co-owners in this space. And Distrito 7 has now become a place where during the day, during the week, there's workshops, there's places for community meetings, and there's also, a nightclub that runs, until late in the night. There's also places to stage productions, and a place, a kind of a sense of accountability to each other where you do practice more sustainable methods and processes and practices, because everyone has a stake. You're not ripping anyone off. You're co-owners in the whole thing. And so, what I would say is that we need to find systems of management that lead to different sorts of outcomes where everyone feels like they have a stake and that they have a say and that multiple voices are heard. And sometimes cooperative or collaborative methods are the best way to achieve that.
That's beautiful. I like the idea about democracy and that having a completely interconnected role with climate justice, and everyone having a voice, and you've talked a lot about that as well, Tiahni. This is kind of off the beaten track of the panel, but I guess I'm wondering, Tiahni specifically, what do you see as, do you think it is necessary for us to, as a nation, adopt the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and do you think that is specifically entrenched in climate justice? I know you've had a role in making that happen, and I want to hear about that in terms of climate justice.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart, if you haven't heard of it, is an incredible piece of work that Dwayne, who spoke earlier, has worked really hard on, along with an amazing group of other incredible First Nations leaders. And I was lucky enough to work with Dwayne on the Youth Summit with the Statement from the Heart. So basically it's getting a constitutionally enshrined voice into Parliament for First Nations people. So a really, really important piece of work where First Nations people are able to make decisions about their own livelihoods, which sounds really simple, but we know that with our history here in Australia that hasn't been the case thus far. And so this piece of work, and bringing that into the Constitution will give First Nations people self-determination over their own livelihoods and rights, which I'm sure we can all agree is an incredibly important thing. So massively important to have that within parts of our election, and thinking about that when you go to vote coming up in terms of climate justice and First Nations justice. I think we've spoken a lot in sort of like the pre-chats to this about the way that so many issues overlap with climate justice in terms of women's rights. For example, Paul Hawken, who had this great video and has produced a book about climate solutions, where he looked at the top 100 practical climate solutions that we can do right now, and in the top 20, the two most impactful things that we can do is look after women identifying people in terms of education, and give options in terms of family planning, so being able to provide contraception if it's something people want, and that sort of thing. So those two things alone are the biggest things that we can do to help combat climate change. So when we look at things like that, we realise that climate justice is completely entrenched in human rights, in social justice, in First Nations justice, in food security. Another thing that really adds up to the top 20 solutions we have is about food waste, and the way that we waste so much of our resources, that we have the ability to feed the whole world time and time again over with what we already have, that the land that we use already for agriculture is far more than enough. We don't need to clear more land for agriculture or for food use. So all of these things are really important. All of these issues in terms of food security, First Nations rights, are overlapping things with the climate justice issues. So when you think about climate justice, you're actually looking at incredible ways to solve massive solutions to our world in so many aspects. If there's one important thing you can do with your life, it's to dedicate your time to looking at solutions for climate justice, because they do accidentally solve a bunch of our other huge social issues, which I think is pretty incredible.
Yeah. It's a very interesting point, because I mean, the way you're talking about it is optimistic and very hopeful, but it is also very easy to fall into this pit of despair with the idea of we are trying to solve all of these issues at once, and how do we find the energy, and as a school striker, I find it quite easy to fall into that, and to feel like there isn't much hope left. And I guess I'm wondering from each of you as campaigners and activists and advocates, sorry, we'll let the ambulance go past.
They're just reminding us that it's a climate emergency.
For each of you, how do you pull yourselves out of despair and look to hope? What are the strategies that you practice for yourselves to be more hopeful about the situation we're in?
I suppose I look backwards and then at where we are now, and I feel that if I'd been looking forwards 20 years ago, I would have been even more profoundly depressed than I am now about the situation, because I wouldn't have seen the potential solutions at hand, and I wouldn't have seen the motivation beginning to emerge. We're in the situation that we are because things are happening too slowly, because humanity woke up too late. But that being said, the rate of change, I think, is astonishing. It's not astonishing enough, but it is astonishing. To think that this state, for example, can be completely self-sufficient with renewable energy, not just on an every now and again, peaking moment, but actually on a regular moment. That within a relatively short time frame, we could be exporting, 3 times as much power as we generate, and it will all be renewable. I mean, that was science fiction 15 years ago, and now it's completely attainable. The science, the engineering is all there. So I console myself with the fact that for a dumb race, we're also a remarkably inventive race, and that we have the capacity to pull ourselves out of the nosedive before we go splat.
That's nice to hear.
I think, backing on to what lovely Rob said, looking at the history of people who have done incredible work in this space. Even today, looking around, there's a bunch of folk from Extinction Rebellion who I did some awesome, fun volunteering and epic sort of social movement and a mobilisation with, and I look at these people who have been doing work in this space for their whole lives, far longer than I've lived, and I think looking back at the way that they've been able to change society and the hope and the perspective that they've given, it is like a relentless, exhausting, somewhat depressing race in a sense. But I think looking at how far we have come, and also immersing yourself in nature, in having time to be able to actually go outside and enjoy what is available to us right now, and holding that strength in the fact that what we have is really pure and beautiful here on Earth, and that things will change over time inevitably, but what the Earth has always been the best at is evolution. We constantly evolve and change with things over time. Our flora and fauna do that, the human race does that, and things will be different inevitably, but if we go out and enjoy what's around us at the moment, it does help instill that sense of emotion within us, which is energy in motion, and you can use that to drive you forwards, to continue to make those change. And being around community, like-minded people, family member, mob, your culture or your groups that you feel really connected and identify with are really great ways to drive you towards making good change and keeping hopeful in what seems like a pretty gloomy race sometimes. How about you, Jess? What do you do?
Well, I actually feel really inspired because, or hopeful, because I know things can change dramatically from one day to the next. And we've just lived through 2 years of completely unexpected, hugely dramatic change where actually there was suddenly the political will to dedicate resources towards, fighting a common enemy or what I describe our initial COVID response as a global act of care towards the most vulnerable people in our community to say, we're going to stay home, we're going to, for the first time in my lifetime, the economy came second to society. And I found that incredibly inspiring. Imagine, if we could do that to deal with one issue, this global pandemic, could we harness that same energy to deal with this slower moving, but much more devastating challenge that we're facing? And back in 2006, the Stern Review forecast that it would take about 2% of global GDP to address the climate crisis, and it's still estimated to be about 2% of GDP. And in countries like the UK, they've spent something like 14% of GDP on battling COVID over the last few years, to not great effect, to be honest. And, places like the US spend 17% of their GDP on the worst healthcare system in the world. So the money is there. The tools are there. We've got all the answers and the technology. We don't need Elon Musk to invent anything to solve the climate crisis. We don't need alien infrastructure. It's all here on planet Earth. We've got all the goodwill and all the resources. We just need to redirect political will to actually prioritise the continued survival of humanity, which, seems pretty self-evident. But what we need to do is get better at telling that story, and the arts are powerful at telling that story. But as citizens, we also need to be clearer in our ask, and we need to say, look, the estimates are, even if we just look at this with a pure economic rationalist point of view, it'll cost 18% of GDP if we don't take action. It'll take 2% of GDP if we do take action. The economic conservatives would take action right now. And it's not just setting the money up in a bonfire and setting it alight, right? That money is going to go towards building more sustainable systems that use human ingenuity and human capital to build a fairer world that we actually want to live in. I mean, it will generate more wealth and abundance if we, change course and we do this. And it can be done, because it's happened over the last few years.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me that it is cheaper to solve the climate crisis than it has been to solve COVID. And it really shows that it is in our will as people to push the government to do that, because there isn't the financial incentive for them to not do it anymore. I mean, I say that, but they are also funded largely by fossil fuels. both major parties. And so this is a question for everyone here. What is it that what are the solutions that are out there, and how do we ask our representatives to give them to us? Big question.
So broad.
It is so broad. What's existing that we can do?
So many amazing, crazy technologies. I was doing some research last night and I found, I'm just going to nerd out for a sec, so bear with me, these squares of carpet that draw CO2 and HFCs into the carpet and convert it into organic carbon. How wild is that? However, it doesn't have to be that technical. There are amazing things that do that naturally, like nature, funnily enough, does it all by itself without having to invent a square of carpet. So really simple things like reforestation, buying back land and planting more biomass back into the land is a really easy solution that we can do. I've just started working for a seaweed company that works with Asparagopsis, and that draws down CO2, turns it into organic carbon that can be consumed by livestock, and then when the livestock eat Asparagopsis, it reduces their methane output by up to 90%, which is huge. That's a massive, effective climate solution, right? So there are those types of things all available, as well as obviously we've got great solutions in terms of energy, in terms of powering things with wind and water and the sun. It all just relates back to nature, really, funnily enough.
Yeah, I think, the power of the ballot box one day, hopefully, will decide this. And that needs everybody to decide that this is the most important thing, and that therefore whoever is standing to be elected to be our government will rate it as the most important thing. When I was coming down here from the hills, I drove past, the inevitable 40 corflute signs attached to light poles all the way down. Like, one person was promising a dog park, another was promising a better highway interchange. There was, we need a stadium, we don't need a stadium. And it just sort of beggars belief that going past all of those corflute signs, there was not a single one that said anything about the most important thing that we're all facing. The green signs were there, and we know that they stand for the environment, but that's it. One day the ballot box has got to win in this discussion.
Yeah. Jess, I feel like you're going to have some solutions about this.
I feel like I would jump through the screen. Oh my God, so many things. Everything you've just said, but I'm about to say the most boring thing that we need. We need better building standards. So, one of the people I spoke to for my book said that Australia has the most expensive, poorly built housing in the world. And no one, I'm from Sydney, everybody just talks about property all day long, and nobody here wants to learn about the fact that our houses are crap. They don't actually keep heat in when they need to and keep cool when they should, and they are just energy sick. So we need better building standards across the board. We need better fuel standards. We have some of the worst fuel in the world, not because better fuel isn't out there, but because our governments haven't imposed high standards. So let's ask for those boring things. We need to ask for tax reform. After a couple of drinks, I end up talking about tax reform because I'm super excited like that. But, we are subsidising pollution to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars around the world, and we're creating perverse incentives and making it free to pollute and cheap and expensive to do the right thing and to have circular production methods. And so these are things that we can easily change. We just need to ask for those boring things, not the dog park and the stadium, but these sorts of boring things. And the last thing I'll say is that we need to put citizens in charge, and there are really great examples. You've had a great example in SA of a citizens' convention on nuclear waste and the storage of it, and there are other models like the Citizens' Convention on Climate that took place in France a couple of years ago, where 150 citizens from across France aged 16 to 80 were selected at random by text message and were charged with writing France's climate policy, and they did a really good job. And actually a lot of that was taken on board. One of the consequences was that France have now banned short distance flights, domestic flights where a train route exists along that route. So people have great ideas and people can direct their elected representatives to actually enact those if we empower them through mechanisms like climate convention.
It's great to hear about that. It's great to hear about those solutions being enacted right now. But I do have one more question for you before we go over to audience question time, so don't worry, you will be given an opportunity to ask some questions. But the last thing I want to ask is, what can we do as artists, but also as citizens in the next few weeks and days? What is the one most important thing we can do? A lot of these solutions are very either technologically based, or we don't necessarily have the power to enact them on an individual level. So what is the most important thing we can do, particularly in the arts, but also just as people, from each of you?
I think the easiest thing you can do is have a quick Google search of sustainable banks and super companies. And if yours isn't in there, pull your money out of it and find an ethical, sustainable company that is, because you're an accidental shareholder in fossil fuels, or your money's being used dirtily in some sort of way. And you would be incredibly surprised at the amount of companies that have investments into these spaces, and while your super is accumulating for you when you're ready to retire, or your bank is accumulating money for when you're about to buy a house or whatever you want to do with it or not, you're accidentally putting money into a bunch of really dirty things for the environment. So that's a really quick thing you can do. And the best thing about technology now is that you can literally sign up and get a new bank account. I did mine in 2 minutes. That was how quick it was. So that's a really quick thing to do. As well as you can check your carbon footprint online, have a look at sort of the spaces that you are having a massive impact. I think broader than the individual thing, it's really important that we do the individual bits and pieces, but more broadly is making sure that your vote is in the right place, making sure that you have a voice in these spaces, that you lobby your politicians, that you understand where, if you're putting a vote, say, into an independent, that you know where that ends up going after that. As we know, it might go into, well, it will go into Liberal, Labor, and just knowing whereabouts your votes will accumulate to. And then go and spend some time in nature and remember why you're here and why you're alive. Feel that connectedness within yourself and to each other, and remember what you stand for, which is what we stand on. We are so lucky to be here, and as much as it's a hectic, massive problem, we have come so far, and we have the knowledge and solutions and the ways that we can deal with this. And it's an exciting time to be really creative, intuitive, to share our skills with others, whether that's through arts and music or whether that's through science. We all have a place in this journey. Find what excites and ignites you in this space and go with that. It doesn't have to be everything possible. It can be what you're most passionate about and those small, tangible changes, and do your best in that space. And then while you're doing that, make sure that First Nations people have a seat at the table and they're included in what you're doing.
I'm just going to agree with everything that you said, but it is said a lot that we should electrify everything, and I think in terms of the power part of the problem that we've got, and we know that the generation of power is a huge piece of the problem relating to climate change. Electrification and then the production of electricity through renewable sources is the single biggest thing that we can do. So, I think the idea of first take your own carbon footprint to neutral, if you can at all, and sometimes that can take resources, and sometimes that can take, having to pull back from one thing in order to divert it to the more important thing. And for some people, it's, they're not going to be able to afford solar panels on their roofs. They're not going to be able to afford an electric car. But all of us can prioritise different things in order to push towards that. I mean, Australia's slowness at taking up electric vehicles, for example, is just pathetic. It's absolutely shameful. These things are going to become not only the way of eliminating a vast amount of oil that's being consumed at the moment, but they will also become the mobile power packs that also power our houses and that provide this huge community resource in the same way that PV on roofs has turned into a massive community resource. Again, to go back to the sort of thing of that science fiction, 20 years ago, if you'd said so many people are going to personally fork out and put solar panels on their roofs, that it's conceivable that you could be generating a third of the state's power supply from citizen investment in their own property is remarkable. And this is all doable, so electrify.
So I would say have better conversations with people. And it's so easy to just be complacent and fall into the doom and gloom and to just consume news that is about how doomed it all is. But we are the most privileged people on the most privileged island on this planet, and each of us has a responsibility to actually be a part of the solution. And it's easier for us than I think for anyone else anywhere in the world, because of some of those factors that Rob talked about as well. So change your media diet so you're consuming more of the good news stories that show that this is possible, and that we all have a role to play in it, and have conversations with people about what they can do and what you can do together. Because as Tiahni said, where your money sleeps at night does more good or harm than you can do during the day. That's something that Kat Taylor, a woman I interviewed for the book, told me. And there's a global network of values-based banks, and find out if your bank is part of that, and find out if your super fund is doing good. As Tiahni said, your money really makes a huge difference. Vote, but also show up in the time between elections. So that means be a voice of climate action in your local area. So I'm a local government councillor, right? And my inbox looks like a whole bunch of no. No, we don't want this project, no playgrounds, no playing fields, no cycleway. Do you know how wonderful it is to get an email about yes? It doesn't take much, if you just see a cycleway project in your area or a solar project or something that is a climate positive action or community positive action, just bang out an email that says, yes, I support this, because actually your voice has an impact. And so just show up in that time between elections as well, and tell everyone you know that it does matter that you vote, and it does matter who you vote for, because the complacency that we have in this country is something we really need to address as well.
Great stuff. And the idea of saying yes was really beautiful from you, Jess. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions from anyone in the audience. So if there's something you're dying to ask any of these people, or all of them, please make your way over to the microphone, which is in this brick path down the middle of the space. Please make your way there, ask a question, and also keep in mind that we are coming up on a state election and we're coming up on a federal election, and among all of the things we've said have been really strong messages about placing your vote and where to place it, and it's always wise to vote for the future and vote for climate action. But I think we have a question from the audience.
Hi, thank you all so much for your insights so far. I think Jess spoke to this a little bit just now, but I'd be interested to hear everybody's thoughts on it. Rob mentioned that until we get climate change as kind of the number one issue around elections, we're in trouble. And there's a sort of wild-eyed desperation when I look at the amount of people here and think, well, if Australia's been on fire and flooded so recently, what else can we do to get people pushing the politicians in the way you've suggested? So I'm just wondering, what do you think we need to overcome to get that mass message out there?
Gosh, big one, isn't it?
Comfort to a certain degree. Australia is a place that has a wonderful capacity for inertia, and it's a really comfortable place to live, notwithstanding fires and floods, which make it less comfortable. I think that somehow, and it can be difficult, but the intensity of the public discourse around this has to go up. And Ord, you've been involved in the youth movement for climate change, which has been incredible. And I think, shaming for my generation, the generation that follows mine, that, when there's this huge march going down through the middle of the city, and I said to all of our staff, come on, let's get down there and join, and it was like very few other people in the city did. I felt like all of the offices in the city should have just emptied to join that march. It was a phenomenal moment, and one that gives me enormous hope. But it's getting over that sense of someone else will look after it. It's how can I do anything about it? It's too big. It's a problem that's unsolvable. I mean, all of the reasons to do nothing, all of the reasons to remain comfortable. One can simply only address all of those personally and say we have to express and live our discomfort, and we need to agitate other people and make them feel uncomfortable.
And we need to unify. Because, Tiahni's here from SEED, which is an Indigenous climate youth organisation, and, the numbers that would come from SEED and School Strike joining together to put on huge protests would be astronomical. That's what should be happening. We should be seeing companies and organisations and protesters joining together to speak our minds on this and make it a real issue for the politicians. We do have another question from the audience, but Tiahni and Jess, if there's something you want to say on that, go for it.
Can I jump in on this one really quickly? That I think we suffer as well from really simplistic storytelling, and I think it's really difficult because it seems like all of these things are happening on their own, but they're all actually connected. And I think we need to get better at telling and receiving and maintaining the thread across these different stories, because next, in a couple of months' time when you go to buy your winter vegetables, they're going to be really expensive because of all the primary producers that were impacted by these floods just now. That's the same story that we need to keep telling. We need to keep that thread connected. And we need to play a part, as creative people, but also as citizens in the community. And I think we also have to resist this move that's gone from denial to despair. We've gone from climate denial to climate despair. Oh, it's too hard. We're past the point of no return. We might as well all just move to New Zealand and build a nice bunker. That is, the most irresponsible, privileged, and ridiculous thing that we could do, because we're just giving in. And humanity has overcome huge obstacles, every generation, and this is our obstacle to overcome. So we know we can do it. We know humanity can do it, and we know these things can happen very quickly. Just this week, the EU have said that by the end of the year they're going to cut their reliance on Russian gas by 2/3. When the will is there, the action follows very, very quickly. So we've got to resist that urge to climate despair as well.
Yeah.
I think just to back on to Jess, what was said a bit earlier with Bella Dwayne when he was having a conversation before, was often as humans we find things hard to relate to until it directly impacts us and our sort of inner circle. And we found that with COVID, right? No one really cared about isolating or wearing masks or getting vaccinated until people in their direct circles started getting sick or people started dying that they actually knew, and then it was like, oh my god, this is actually a huge impact on my life. And so the power of having a conversation, as much as it sounds incredibly lame, but the power of a conversation and being able to communicate the way that climate change does affect people, why petrol is so expensive, why these floods and fires are happening, is really important. There's the amazing impact of science and research that's incredibly important. There's the way that the arts convey that as well, which is incredibly important. And then there's just the art of having a conversation to help bring people together and allow them to realise that you are directly being impacted by the issues that we're having, and playing a part in that is incredibly important. And also having, I guess, the mindset when we do speak to people to know that we do have something to learn from everyone that we speak to. Whether we agree with their biases or not, we can learn from something about why they think the way they do and help have a conversation in terms of making it more relatable and something that's more understandable for them.
Now, we've only got time for one more question. Yeah. We've only got time for one more question, but you can come and talk to any of the panellists and myself after the session. So, yes, please go.
Cool. All right. First of all, I'll just say on that coming together, I think chalk is a wonderful medium. I'm done with my self-promotion. Well, no, it's not self-promotion, but it's something that I'm bringing to the conversation there. As to New Zealand, I've been there. It's too nice. If you come from Australia, it's actually a big, ugly country. Is beautiful, and so no, I've been there. It's not an option. But as a parent, I've been involved in conservation and the environmental space for a very long time. So I'm very, very aware, as I've raised my children over the last 10 years, creating this protective bubble around them, that our very biosphere is being shredded at the same time. And I never told them about climate change because they were so little, they don't need to know. What I did do is contextualise them about history for a long time. And it wasn't until Extinction Rebellion came along that I found a way to talk to my children about the situation we were in by having them attend a die-in. And there was something about the Extinction Rebellion die-in, that mix of the red rebels, the colour, the beauty, the evocativeness, the symbolism, and the assertive resistance that I felt could communicate something I wasn't comfortable to communicate to my children. So why I'm asking that is, as I've been talking along on these bricks by bricks throughout the day, I've been thinking about art, and that artists are rule breakers. That's the role of the artist, is to face taboo and to show us that we don't need to do things the way we've always done. So Extinction Rebellion have taken up that, they've led in that conversation about non-violent civil disobedience. Of course we need action at every level, in every sphere, but I'm just wondering if any of you have anything to say on the specific role of non-violent civil disobedience as a way to unleash creativity at this time.
Yeah. I think you've hit on something really interesting, because we've seen a lot of those Extinction Rebellion protests here, and non-violent civil disobedience is what most successful protest movements have used over the years. The civil rights movement and many more. I think that there's something about that performance art, which is what you're talking about, like the idea of performance art, and what is the significance of that?
I think it has its great place in terms of being able to convey that message to a large group of people that can be both shocking and confronting. But I also think that everyone has a different part to play within that conversation and within that space. And the simple thing of, I used to do a lot of stuff at XR and I absolutely loved it, and I loved working within the arts and utilising that change. But then when I started working for the government a couple of years ago, that changes the way that you're able to interact with these types of things. And so I think everyone has a place and a part to play within these conversations, and it's just about doing what you can. And if you are passionate about civil disobedience and you think that that's your role and that you'd like to be creative in the arts and do that, then absolutely do that. It's shown to have incredible effects over the whole history of time. If you just look up civil disobedience, if you haven't heard about it, you'll see that massive movements have been made, huge mobilisations of people. There's been lots of stuff in the US and the UK with Extinction Rebellion, where a bunch of people stayed on a bridge and blocked off a whole bridge, and it resulted in people getting arrested and people getting pulled off of the bridge as well, and it really paid media attention to the climate crisis for that period of time. So it definitely has a really important part to play, but if you can't quite engage in that, then just do your bit in what you can, but if you can, absolutely.
Yeah, completely. I think that our time is pretty much up, but if any of you have closing remarks, please go ahead and say them. And after this, we have the Bake Fridge Collective coming up, so we will move off the stage, but please feel free to come and talk to us. We're good. Thank you so much for being here for this panel today and for listening, and I hope to see you all around for the rest of the day.